tension. So, Bridge, there's a lot of pieces, a lot of different parts to the piece, but I think it'd probably be a best way to sort of start our conversation. You say in the piece, nuclear weapons are back in Asia. So a very simple question, why?
Great. Well, thanks, Harry. Great to be here, as always. 4 basic reasons. First, China's conventional military power is growing. And if this isn't rectified, if the United States does not maintain the kind of lead it's had in the past, which seems pretty unlikely, then ultimately you're going to have a more even conventional military balance in the Pacific, particularly in the Western Pacific. Now, what this means is that conflict becomes more plausible, more calculable, is the old way of putting it. But basically, the use of force could become more attractive for China. They could reason that they could actually succeed in the waters or the skies or the islands of the Western Pacific. And what this means is that if conflict starts and the conventional forces are more even, it becomes a lot harder for the United States to prevail. And the kinds of things that it needs to do could themselves, whether deliberately or not, potentially more likely lead to nuclear escalation. I mean, the way I think about it is, in the future, if current trends continue, which they, at least some level probably will, the U.S. will have to fight harder, dirtier, more quickly, for longer, and kind of nastier to work its will. And to give you a concrete example, in the past, the United States might have been able to take a kind of leisurely approach to blocking a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, for instance. In the future, it's going to be much tougher. We might have to strike deeper, more quickly, and more sensitive targets. And this raises the classic sort of inadvertent escalation problems, where people can get to nuclear war because things get out of control.
Right.
The second reason is that China's nuclear force is becoming considerably more sophisticated and somewhat larger, and I think this is going to give China over time, even if it doesn't necessarily, or even if all Chinese don't necessarily want it, or I'm thinking in these terms, it's going to give China more options for deliberate, controlled use, and this is going to make their own threats to use nuclear weapons more credible and thus more strategically relevant. So the U.S. is going to have to think, well, in the past, the Chinese idea of using nuclear weapons was we'll blow up L.A. That's very high in the escalatory ladder. Mm-hmm. As their force gets more sophisticated, it's more professionalized, it's more modern, advanced, they're going to be able to have more tailored, more narrow options, which is going to be more strategically relevant. The third reason is, look, the Chinese have been spending 10% increase on their defense budget for a decade and a half. Looks like it's going to continue. Xi Jinping doesn't seem to be changing that at all. The Chinese could gain conventional superiority in the Western Pacific, which is where U.S. allies like Japan and South Korea, Australia are, a partner like Taiwan. So it might be the U.S. itself that may want to rely on nuclear weapons to compensate for China's conventional advantages in the way that we did in the Cold War. This is something you often see go back and forth. The Russians rely on nuclear weapons now to compensate for NATO's conventional superiority. In the past, it was vice versa. Now, that's going to seem unappealing to a lot of people, obviously, particularly in the United States. But that raises the fourth reason, which is if the Chinese establish conventional superiority in the region, and if the United States is not willing to credibly extend nuclear deterrence on behalf of its allies and partners in the region, then they may seek nuclear weapons. In fact, from a purely sort of realpolitik strategic point of view, it would not be irrational to do so. And of course, you hear rumblings in South Korea, occasionally in Japan. Not very serious right now, but these countries have pursued nuclear weapons in the past. The Japanese less than the South Koreans. Of course, Taiwan has several times, Australia even. So I think these are sort of 4 reasons, and they're basically driven by the development of China's military power, which is a function of its rise and growing strength.
Excellent. No, that makes a lot of sense. So maybe the more immediate question is, where does the third offset come in all this? There's a lot of talk about it. We don't know a lot, but I'd just like to get your quick reaction.
Sure. Well, it's something I've been thinking a lot about. I mean, I think the main thing with the third offset is it has to take the potential for nuclear escalation into account. A lot of the rhetoric that we've heard about the third offset, particularly from the non-governmental, but also from the DoD side, has been focused on the challenge to U.S. conventional superiority. And that's absolutely right. I mean, that is the main thing that the third offset is rightly focused on is preserving U.S. conventional advantages, because we don't want to go down this Asia goes nuclear pathway if we can avoid it. And the way you avoid Asia going nuclear is to maintain, to the extent possible, U.S. conventional advantages. The problem is if we go down the third offset path without thinking about our adversary's ability to use nuclear weapons, we're going to walk into a cul-de-sac. Either we're going to put ourselves into a situation where even if we succeed in sustaining our advantages, they may think, hey, we can use nuclear weapons to escalate ourselves out of this problem. Russia would be a potential example of that. They're thinking a lot about the use of nuclear weapons to deal with NATO's conventional advantages. Or, we may end up, ignoring the possibility that we might want to think about how to use nuclear weapons in a controlled way to gain our strategic objectives. So I think the main message is that the third offset has to take account nuclear weapons and how they are an integral part, even if often implicit part of a potential conflict. The last QDR rightly said that the U.S. should not allow its adversaries to escalate their way out of a conflict. We know that a lot of them are thinking about how they could do that with nuclear weapons or otherwise. We need to be thinking about nuclear weapons integrated in with the third offset in order to make sure they can't do that.
Excellent. So final question for you. So looking at sort of the future of U.S. nuclear weapons strategy, doctrine, weapon systems, if we're thinking about using sort of classic deterrence again in a nuclear sense, is the size of our forces too small, too little, just right? Where do you see that going?
I think size is not the primary issue that I'm thinking about. I mean, look, I wouldn't reduce our stockpile, particularly our active stockpile, unless there's a compelling reason to do so, and I don't really see one. I mean, I don't believe in a world without nuclear weapons, so I don't really get it. I believe in arms control, but I believe arms control should be oriented towards stability and these kinds of things. What's more important with our force is that it be adapted to the strategic circumstances in which we find ourselves. I mean, my sense is there's an increasing recognition that the idea of a world without nuclear weapons is kind of a pipe dream, or at least not realizable in the next few decades, that the world is becoming more unstable and more dangerous, and that, look, we need nuclear weapons around here as our insurance policy in a variety of ways, and we should have the force that we need. And so, we have a Cold War force we have a force that was specifically designed for Cold War purposes. I mean, often engineered precisely for Cold War missions, silo busting, these kinds of things. I'm not saying we have to do a wholesale overhaul. I mean, it's important that we keep that kind of devastating threat capability. But I would want capabilities for selectivity, variability of yield, for instance, certain kinds of effects that we could achieve. I mean, ideally, the kind of nuclear force that we would want would be one in which the president or whoever he's delegated to could use nuclear weapons in a way to, impose costs on the opponent, but also in a way that's limited enough to allow de-escalation. And there's some elements of our force that are good for that, but there's some that are less so. So I think there's movement. There was an article in the LA Times a couple days ago about growing sense of the need to think in this direction. But there's also a lot of opposition. Senator Feinstein had an op-ed the other day. That was kind of classic, sort of more idealistic, progressive thinking. So this is going to be a debate, but we can't wish ourselves out of it. But I think numbers are not the main issue.